Revelation chapter 8. Is it chapter 8? Yeah, chapter 8. Yes, it is chapter 8. So, what we have, where we're at here, is we have this seal that John had seen in the throne room, the scroll that John had seen in the throne room of heaven, and it had 7 seals on it, and the Lamb took it, and the Lamb began to open the seals, and as each one of these seals was opened, he began to have a vision of some things that were going to happen in the future in what we know as the end times. And so we've looked at the first 6 seals, and then tonight the 7th seal will be opened. And I believe I've told you already that the 7th seal actually contains 7 trumpets. And so when this 7th seal opens, then we're going to start having these trumpets. Now these trumpets, this is where judgment really starts happening. This is where you're going to see that God is really beginning to bring actual judgment upon the earth. This is not just hard times or tribulation. This is actual judgment that happens in these trumpets. And you're also going to see, and we won't see it tonight, or maybe even not next week, maybe next week, the 7th trumpet will actually introduce what we call 7 bowls of wrath. So the 7th seal introduces the 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet will introduce the 7 bowls. So let me just start in chapter 1 of verse 8. It says, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. So I really don't make much of this. I'm sure it has meaning, but the only reason I point it out is because from the moment that John got caught up in John chapter 4, from the moment he got caught up to heaven, there has been activity going on in the throne room of heaven. There has been praising. There was the 24 elders. There was the 4 cherubim, and then there was all the when the seals started opening in that 5th seal, there was all the martyrs, and then the 6th seal, there was all those that came out of the tribulation. There was all this praise and all this stuff that was going on in the throne room of heaven. But when the 7th seal is open, it says there was silence for about 30 minutes. This is the calm before the storm, you might say. This is a period where the preparation is being made. Actually, it doesn't take long if it's only 30 minutes, but the preparation is being made. And like I said, God is about to begin to pour out his wrath. So verse 2, he says, and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And then another angel having a golden censer came, and he stood at the altar, and he was given much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints upon the golden altar which is before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. Then he took the censer. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, threw it to the earth, and there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. So in verse 2, the thing he saw is he saw these 7 angels. They were each got their trumpet. They were getting ready. But something happens between the time that these guys get their trumpet, these angels get their trumpets, and the time that the first one blows. And there's this interesting little scene there. I think it's interesting. John's still in the throne room of heaven. All right, and he sees this interesting little scene where this one angel comes to this altar that's in front of the throne. And he's got incense that's going to be burnt on this altar. And he has some bowls with incense burning in them and smoke. And he says that he has the prayers of the saints. Here's the reason I'm kind of pointing this out. If you read Exodus chapter 30, the first 10 verses, so in Exodus, there's a description that God gives to Moses of the tabernacle, of all of the things in the tabernacle. And he comes in, the first thing there is this the brazen altar, they called it, which is the altar where they did the sacrifices. And then you came to this laver, which is where they washed. And then you went into this place called the holy place. All right, and so it was not an outdoor place, it was an indoor. And so in the holy place, on one side was the table of showbread. On one side was the golden lampstands. And then right in the middle, there is this other enclosed place, and it is the Holy of Holies. And inside, right behind the veil, in front of the Holy of Holies, is the Ark of the Covenant. It was considered the throne of God. That was the mercy seat. It was God's throne. That was where God lived. So when God is giving Moses the instructions of how to build all this, right in front of the Holy of Holies, there is an altar of incense. And the thing I'm trying to point out, the thing I want you to see is that what God instructed them to build on the earth is exactly what exists in heaven. That directly in front of his throne room is this altar of incense. Directly in front of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle was an altar of incense. It was a place where they burned the incense. And so and we clearly have here that this is symbolic of the prayers of God's people going up before God. So verse 3, another angel having a golden censer came and he stood at the altar. He was given much incense that he should offer it with the prayers of the saints upon the golden altar which was before the front throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints ascended before God from the angel's hand. And so this is a great picture, y'all. Listen, our prayers are literally going up before the throne of God. They are literally there. They are literally going up, literally before the throne of God. Our prayers go to the very presence of God. Now, I do believe that it just says the prayers of the saints. It doesn't qualify them as only the prayers of the saints at that time. Or this is happening, and this is what's in the throne room of heaven right now. This altar is in front of the throne, and this incense and this smoke, and I also believe it's the prayers of the saints that are on this altar and that are going up and rising up before the throne of God. And I just want us to remember that our prayers are not unheard. All right? Now, I know sometimes it feels like they are. I get it. I know that. I know that sometimes it feels like they are, and that we may think that sometimes they are. But listen, every time you start getting in one of those little doldrums about, I don't know if God's even hearing me, you just remember that your prayers are going up on the altar of incense directly in front of the throne of God. They are right there in his throne room. And just remember that. I don't know, that spoke to me. I don't think I conveyed it the way I felt it, but it spoke to me. So, but the next thing that happens, so listen then. So here's the altar. It's in front of the throne. The angel is offering up the incense with the prayers. They are ascending up before the throne room. And so then he takes a censer in verse 5 and he fills it with some of the coals from that altar. He takes some of the coals that are sending up that incense and that are sending up those prayers of the saints, and he puts it into this censer. And he takes this censer and he throws it to the earth. All right? He throws it to the earth, and as it hits the earth, well, it doesn't say as it hits the earth, but it says he threw it to the earth. And as there were noises, there were thunderings, there were lightnings, and there was an earthquake. So here's what I want to point out. And I pointed this out, if you remember, in Revelation chapter 4, and it's in verse 5. When John first sees the throne room of heaven, he says that from the throne proceeded what? Lightnings and thunderings and voices. So when he sees a throne coming out of the throne, there's lightning and there's thundering and there's voices. So when this censer gets thrown to the earth, there is noises, there is lightning, and there is thundering, and there's an earthquake. We also pointed out at that time when we did Revelation chapter 4 that over in Exodus 19:16 and Exodus 20 verse 18, it describes Mount Sinai when God had met Moses up there. So let's see what I said. Exodus 19:16. Said, came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and there were lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all who were in the camp trembled. And chapter 20, what did I say? Chapter 20 verse what? Chapter 20 verse 18. All the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled, and they stood afar off. So here's the connection I'm trying to make. All of these from coming out of the throne to being on Mount Sinai, the thunderings, the lightnings, the noises, the sound of the trumpet, they symbolized, they were a visible representation that God's presence was right there. God's presence was on Mount Sinai. That's why all that was happening. God was on the throne. That's why all of that was coming from the throne. So now I'm making this jump. So he takes the prayers, the fire that's offering up the prayers of the saints, he throws it to the earth, and now all of these same things that represent and are of the presence of God, in essence what is happening now is the presence of God is coming to the earth. And the prayers of the saints are bringing down the power and the presence of God into this world. And the prayers of the saints still do that today. The prayers of God's people bring down the power and the presence of God. If we want the power and the presence of God here in our community, which I would say we all do, it's going to be based upon whether or not we are sending up those prayers to the throne room of God. And it's time to start sending them up. It's time. You know, I preached 2 weeks ago. It was 2 weeks ago, right? From Isaiah chapter 2. And we're going to pray. We're going to ask God to exalt His church. Now, I'm not being selfish. Any of His true church. We're going to ask God to exalt His church. This is what Isaiah 2 said. So these are not selfish prayer requests. That the people will flow to His church with a hunger for His word and with a desire to live in His ways. And that His word will always go out from His church. We need to put those prayers on the altar that are going up before the throne of God. Those are the prayers that will bring the power and the presence of God to this earth. That's what's going to do it at the end as well. There's going to be a lot of people praying as we get closer and closer. Even so, come Lord Jesus. Even so, I've actually kind of, every now and then, I'll just slip that in there at the end. I just said, just go ahead and come, Lord Jesus. Come quickly. And one of these days, He's going to say, all right, it's time. And that angel's going to scoop up that fire off that altar, and he's going to throw it to this earth, and it's going to be time for the trumpets to start blowing. So the trumpets... The 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets, verse 6, prepared themselves to sound. So just quickly, the purpose of the trumpets in their Hebrew biblical culture, one of the purposes was to call the people together. You can, in Numbers chapter 10, is where I'm getting at. There's 3 things that I'm going to tell you that the trumpets were used for. And I'm getting them all out of Numbers chapter 10. Numbers chapter 10, the first ones are 1 through 8. The Lord said to Moses, make 2 silver trumpets for yourself. You shall make them of hammered work. You shall use them for the calling, the congregation, and for directing the movements of the camps. When they blow both of them, all the congregation will gather before you at the door of the tabernacle. But if you blow only one, then only the leaders and the heads and the divisions of Israel shall gather. So you can read the first 8 verses there. So you see that the first purpose that He had for these trumpets was to call the people together. Either call everybody together or just call the leaders together. But it was to call the congregation of Israel. It was to call the people together. Both 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says in both of those passages that the end rapture, the resurrection of God's people, what we call the rapture, is going to be preceded by a trumpet. A trumpet. The purpose of the trumpet was to call the people together. It was to call the congregation together. So now we're getting some of these trumpets. All right. The second reason, verse 9, when you go to war, that's back over in Numbers 10, verse 9. When you go to war in your land against the enemy who oppresses you, then you shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, and you will be remembered for the Lord your God, and you will always be saved from your enemies. The next thing that happens is, the next reason they used it is when they were fixing to go to battle. Well, let me tell you something. Right here, when these trumpets start blowing, God's about to go to battle. God's about to go to battle. And he's signaling. I think this is very, it's not even symbolic. It's actually biblical. That he calls his people together. He calls his church together. And it is time for war. It is a time for battle. He is about to avenge. He is about to pour out his wrath upon the earth against the enemy. The last thing, verse 10 of Numbers chapter 10, also in the day of your gladness and in your appointed feasts and at the beginning of your months, you'll blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices and over your peace offerings. And they shall be a memorial before you, before your God. I am the Lord your God. So they also just did it on special occasions. Well, let me tell you, it don't get much more special than Jesus coming again. Right? It doesn't get much more special than that. Now listen, you guys know, or if you don't know, you're about to learn. I've taught this in here and referenced this into this church several times. I believe that God's historical timeline is based on God's feasts. And they, the Passover, and that was when Christ died. The Feast of Firstfruits, and that was the day Christ resurrected. And the day of Pentecost, and that was the Feast of Pentecost, and that was, we know that on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came. You know what the next feast is that that happens after the day of Pentecost? You know what it is? It's the Feast of Trumpets. It's the Feast of Trumpets. Next call, right here. Next call, we're going up there. Next call, it's time for Christ to come. It's going to be a special occasion. So that's what the trumpets were used for. And this particular time at the end, the calling the people together, the signal of war, and the special occasion, it's going to be all three of them all at one time. It's going to be all three of them. Anything before I go on? Any questions or any observations? Yes, ma'am. Okay.
The Bible says in Numbers that they are going to keep these trumpets like forever. I mean, at least in my translation, something. This is a rule for them forever.
Yes.
Do it today.
I don't know if they are still celebrating the Feast of Trumpets. I don't know. I honestly don't know. They're supposed to, though, right? Which verse are you looking at?
I think somewhere in 8.
Yeah, they'll be to you as an ordinance forever throughout your generations. Yeah. So, I don't know if they're still doing it. They're supposed to be. And actually, probably when a lot of this begins, at some point, they're going to start reinstituting all of this stuff. Even the stuff they've kind of let go of. And when they start reinstituting that, we're going to be getting closer and closer.
Same thing it says for the sons of Aaron who were
The high priest.
they are what do you call it?
The high priest.
Yeah, the high priests. But we know that today Jews don't really, or maybe majority of them, it's messed up. It's
Right.
messed up their lineage. They don't really know
Right.
which tribe they only got.
They're going to reinstitute it. They're going to reinstitute it at some point in history. What?
Feast of Trumpets, September 27th.
Okay. Be careful, Feast of Trumpets. Amen. So I understand, Angelina, what you're saying. Yes, it was given to them and it was supposed to be an ordinance forever. They may have let it go, but they're going to reinstitute it. It's going to come back.
The Psalms that you do in the morning, the experiencing God, and then now Revelation.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so today, day 3 in Experiencing God was about Elijah.
Right.
And about how he built the altar with 12 stones.
Right.
From the 12 tribes.
Right.
And how God sent the fire down. And it's just, I'm just a little mind blown right now.
Right. Amen. Amen.
They were having a feast at the Western Mall when I was there in Jerusalem, but a day doesn't go by that you don't hear the shofar.
Oh, so they blow it every day. So there's,
I've heard people blow it every day.
yeah.
Around that, they was having a feast. I don't remember the feast that was going on, but it was the younger people.
Mm-hmm.
And they just flooded the Western Wall. And I mean, there was shofars going off everywhere.
So the priests are still blowing it every day.
Just in main major city or the entire?
Probably in Jerusalem, probably at the temple. Well, the temple.
People get on at night on top of the hotels.
Uh-huh. Amen. Amen. All right. So I'm going to get through at least the first 4 trumpets because they're pretty easy. And the 5th one is pretty tough. But just like in the seals, the first 4 seals, we called them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They were pretty self-explanatory. And then the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th seal started getting a little, I had to just kind of tell you, I'm not really sure. Well, it's the same way with these trumpets. You're going to have the first 4 trumpets. They're pretty self-explanatory. And then starting with the 5th trumpets, the 5th, 6th, and 7th trumpets also actually have a woe that goes with them. There's a woe. I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyhow, verse 7, the first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So this first trumpet blows, and hail and fire followed behind it, also with some blood, and they were thrown to the earth. So now again, this is the beginning of the judgment of God. This is God pouring out his judgment. And I don't know that I'm going to get to the 5th trumpet tonight in chapter 9. I kind of hope I don't, but if I kind of hope I don't. These are spiritual things, and so there may be things that we don't really understand. But also one of the things I want you to see about these trumpets is that they, in many ways, mirror some of the plagues that God put on Egypt when he was delivering the children of Israel out of Egypt. And so the hail, the fire, and the blood, Exodus 9, 22 through 24. Let me just go ahead and read it. Exodus 9, 22 through 24, and this is like the 7th plague. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man, on beast, and on every herb of the field. Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven. The Lord sent thunder and hail and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land. So there was hail and fire mingled with hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt. So this was a plague that God used in Egypt. And so now it's not only going to, of course, we know his plagues in Egypt were judgments against Egypt. So now he's also going to use this same thing as one of the judgments that he pours out on the end time. So, I really want you to remember that a lot of these trumpets mirror the plagues, because it's really important for the way I interpret. Well, it's really important for the way I interpret the 5th trumpet, is to be honest with you. In Egypt, it was literally hail and fire. And I believe at the end times, it's literally, I don't believe that's symbolic. I believe it's literally hail and fire mingled with blood. I believe that that's literally what it is. But notice this, in all of these, it's going to be 1/3. It's going to be 1/3. So here, 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. How might that affect us?
California's used to it.
Gonna make it harder to breathe.
Hey, listen, we don't exist without the vegetation on this earth. We don't exist. We breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon monoxide, dioxide, monoxide, one of them. What we breathe out, plants breathe in, and what we breathe in, plants breathe out. Right? So if a third of the vegetation is suddenly gone, it's going to affect the ability to breathe. It's going to affect wildlife, which means it's going to affect food. This is going to have, when a third of the vegetation is destroyed, it's going to have drastic, dramatic effect upon all the world, even though it's only a third.
You're saying it's the whole earth, right?
A third of the whole earth, yeah. Yeah, a third of the vegetation on the whole earth. Yeah. The second trumpet, verse 8. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and the third of the ships were destroyed. Okay, so just kind of go back there. Does anybody remember what the first plague God brought upon Egypt was? Turn the river into blood. Turn the river into blood. Second was frogs. Turn the river into blood. So now we have this. Okay, so he said it's like a burning mountain. He doesn't say it was, but he said it was like a great burning mountain. Volcano could be. Piece of machinery could be. Meteor could be. I mean, I don't know, but something like a great big burning mountain was thrown. And again, I don't think we even have to know. I don't even necessarily think we can. It has an equivalent today, because these are spiritual things straight from God. They may be as unique as can be, but it's something. He said it was like a mountain that was on fire. It got thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of all of the creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now look, here's do this. I didn't write down the numbers. I can't believe I didn't write down the numbers. I did. I actually researched this today. So we just got finished talking about how we are dependent upon the vegetation for our oxygen. But did you know that 75% of the oxygen that we breathe in actually comes from the oceans? It actually comes from the oceans. That plankton, that phytoplankton stuff that's everywhere, puts out more oxygen than anything. So when you have a third of the sea and a third of all of the living creatures and a third of everything in the sea that's suddenly gone and a third of the vegetation that's suddenly gone, our oxygen is going to be extremely, extremely depleted. It's going to be tough. Listen, and the ocean, I mean, how many cultures around this world are dependent upon the ocean for their very survival, for just their daily being able to survive. I mean, when these plagues, these are not just these are things that are going to affect everything. A third of the sea animals, a third of the ships. I couldn't think of anything other than a third of the ships are going to sink. I mean, I don't know what to say. Of course, a lot of them are right off the coast of California, so you won't have trouble finding them. They're right there. But anyhow, when the sea is gone, the sea really controls climate. Do you know that? It controls rain. The rain that we get, you know where that water comes from? It comes from the oceans. Evaporates up out of the oceans, turns into clouds. Cloud floats over to southeast Texas, dumps out as rain. That's pretty simplistic, but that's the truth. That's the way it happens. So if you get a third of the sea destroyed, it's going to affect our ability to even live. Not our ability, because we won't be here, but somebody's ability. Right. Somebody's ability to even live. Trumpet 3. Then, starting in verse 10. So then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And the name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. So he says that he saw this star. It fell to the earth. He said it was like a burning torch. So, which would be like a meteor, something like that, falling star. And it falls, and it affects, this one affects the fresh water. It affects the rivers. And the word wormwood actually means undrinkable. And it says that it made a third of all the fresh water undrinkable. It said it was undrinkable because it was bitter. Well, if it's undrinkable, it's also not going to provide life for anything that lives in it. If it's undrinkable, it's also not going to sustain the vegetation that is around it. But even so, you already hear little rumblings about a water crisis worldwide. Well, just wait till a third of the water that we do have is undrinkable. You want to talk about a water crisis? We're going to have a water crisis. It's going to be real, and it's going to happen.
Everybody's gonna go to Walmart tonight and they leave.
Buy water. You ever wonder if they're just like some big warehouse somewhere and they're just filling it up out of the tap?
Wouldn't be surprised.
I'm going to say that's what's happening. They ain't getting that water out of the springs of Colorado.
Yeah, these do. It goes and does that.
Yeah. See some old guy out there with a big sack of bottles on his back and he's dipping up water. No.
It already says on the bottle, in the municipal water supply of the city of Houston, it's just been filtered.
It's just filtered water. Yeah. All right. Yes, sir.
The first three angels that sounded, each one of them got fire involved in it.
Judgment. It's judgment. Yeah. Fire most always represents judgment when it's equated with God like that, yeah. Eyes like fire, all that kind of thing. It's judgment. So then in verse 12, so the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened, a third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. Okay, so this next angel sounds, and so now you get the sun, the moon, and the stars. So I don't know if you remember this or not, but one of the plagues in Egypt was darkness. It was darkness. But remember, it said it was a darkness that you could almost feel. It was so thick you couldn't see it all. But it was one of the plagues. It was darkness. So I'm really just wanting you to keep in your mind how these judgments that he's pouring out are equivalent and equate to the judgments that he poured out upon Egypt during that time when he delivered his children. So this is darkness. So, if a third of the sun is gone, and you're going to get something a little bit later where it's going to be the opposite, where the sun is going to scorch people. But at this point, if you took away a third of the sun, we'd start dying from not having enough heat. All right? It would affect the vegetation also. If the moon, so the moon affects tides, so when you start getting this judgment upon the celestial, I don't know what else to call them, the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, again, you're talking about the ability of people to even survive on earth, to go with all of these other things. A day of darkness. A lot of the prophets, Joel, Zechariah, I think even Isaiah, a lot of the Old Testament prophets, when they begin to prophesy about the day of the Lord, one of the things they always say is, it's going to be a day of darkness, a day of darkness, a day of darkness. And it was just by coincidence, I saw this thing today I saw it on Facebook. It's been so nice to go for years without saying I saw something on Facebook in here. And I don't know when it was put out. I think it was in December. But this lady lives the North Pole maybe. and like the sun rose at like 12:02, and then it set at like 12:57, and they were going to have like 4 months of just darkness from then on. And I thought, that's pretty crazy, you know. But, you know, when you're on, I don't know which pole it was, but when you're on the poles, you know, that's the way it is. Well, it's going to be dark too. It's going to be dark in the end when God blots out a third of that sun and a third of the moon. It's going to be cold. It's going to be cold. So verse 13, and I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst. Now some of your translations may say an eagle. Does any of you have a translation that says an eagle right there? Okay. Yeah, okay. And either's fine. It does not say a parrot. That's that contemporary English version. No. So I looked and I heard an angel flying through the midst of the heavens, saying with a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the remaining blast of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound." So after this 4th trumpet goes off, there is this angel, some kind of flying creature, flying through the world, and he's saying, "Woe, woe, woe." There's 3 more trumpets, and these trumpets are going to be woes. These next 3 trumpets, they are going to be hard. They are going to be serious. So look, I tell you what I'm going to do. I've only got 7 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and stop, because the reason is because this 5th trumpet, man, if I can't even explain to you how much I went round and round trying to figure this thing out. And I really haven't figured it out, but I'm going to tell you what I think. The problem here is that what I think isn't what the smart people think. That's one of my problems. So now I'm going to tell you what the smart people think, just so you'll know who you ought to side with. But then I'm going to tell you what I think. And my problem is that when something is confusing for me in the Bible, I tend to just look at it very literally. I tend to just let the Bible say what it says, even if I don't get it. And that's kind of how I come down on this 5th trumpet. All right. So, but you'll see that next week. But you can read chapter 9 next week, and we'll look at that 5th trumpet. It's really interesting, and it's interesting whatever you think it represents. It's interesting. Anything before I close?
I heard that the pastor sees his shadow today.
If he sees his shadow, what?
That's 6 more weeks of the same.
6 more weeks of the same sermons. All right, brother. That's pretty good.